Hello, everyone. For those of you who pay attention to this sort of thing, you might have noticed that this episode is shorter than usual, and it was released on a Monday. That is because I'm shaking up the format a little. I've been at this almost a year now, and I've noticed a couple of things. First, my listeners seem to like the shorter Friday episode format better. Also, planning for an hour-long Tuesday episode with 4 topics really screws up a weekend. So, moving forward, your neighbor on the left will have episodes on Mondays, Wednesdays, and Fridays. Each will be shorter, focusing on one main subject. Fridays will still be Back Porch Files, with an effort to focus not necessarily on current events, but try for a larger sort of zoomed out view on things. I plan on keeping the high note segment that usually ended the Tuesday episodes, but it will be a true end of the week high note coming at the end of Back Porch Files episodes. All right, so I'm sure I've bored you plenty with the inner workings of things here, so let's get down to business. Hello, everyone, and welcome to Your Neighbor on the Left, the podcast where we talk about progressive politics, human decency, and life on the blue side of America's ideological divide. My name is Don Spielis, and I am, as ever, your host. Today, I want to jump right in and talk about something sad and more than a bit disturbing. By now, most of you are aware that Robert Mueller passed away this past Friday. And before we dive into anything political, because of course we will, everything is political these days, I want to start somewhere that feels increasingly rare in our current timeline that we're living in. I want to start off by talking about the man himself. Because if we're going to talk about the reaction to his death, we owe it to ourselves to understand the life that came before it. Not the headlines, not the arguments, not the version of him that has been filtered through years of political conflict, just the man. Robert Mueller was a Marine. And not in the way that sometimes gets casually mentioned in biographies, not in a distant or symbolic sense. He volunteered to serve in Vietnam during one of the most divisive and dangerous periods in American history. And I think that matters. It matters even more when you understand that he didn't have to go. He had a legitimate knee injury, something that could have qualified him for a deferment, a real deferment, the kind that many people took advantage of during that time. He had a path that would have kept him out of combat, and he chose not to take it. He signed up and went anyway. He served as a Marine officer in Vietnam. He saw combat. He experienced war, not as an abstraction, not as a policy debate, but as something immediate and personal. And during that service, he was awarded a Bronze Star and a Purple Heart. And those aren't ceremonial recognitions. Those are earned in circumstances most of us will never experience. That most people can't even truly fathom. He didn't talk all that much about his service. That part of his life wasn't particularly political. It wasn't ideological. It doesn't belong to one party or another. He didn't give comments regularly about how he understood combat, though he certainly did. He didn't feel it needed much comment, apparently. It was simply a matter of record. It stood for itself. It was service. Now, after Vietnam, that pattern of service continued. Mueller built a career that, by any objective standard, was defined by public service. He didn't move into the private sector to maximize wealth. He didn't disappear into obscurity. He stayed in the system, in law enforcement, in the Department of Justice, in roles that required intellect and discipline, restraint, and a willingness to operate largely out of the spotlight. He served as a U.S. attorney. He held senior leadership roles within the Department of Justice. And eventually, he was appointed director of the FBI. And it's important, I think, to say this clearly because it gets lost sometimes in all the noise. Robert Mueller was a Republican. Not in the performative sense, not as a label applied later. He was a Republican who was appointed by a Republican president and who continued serving under leadership from both parties. And I think that continuity matters. It speaks to something that used to be much more common in American government, a belief that certain roles, certain positions, especially in law enforcement and national security, were meant to operate above partisan politics. And, as they say, those were the days, I guess. As FBI director, Mueller led the Bureau through one of the most difficult periods in modern American history, the years following the attacks on September 11th. That was a moment when the country was dealing with fear and uncertainty and a rapidly evolving understanding of national security threats. The decisions made during that time carried enormous, long-lasting consequences. And whether you or I agree with every decision that was made during those years or not, the reality is that the position required seriousness. It required steadiness. It required someone who understood the weight of the responsibility that his position held. Sadly, in many cases, that is another element of a bygone era. Mueller served as FBI director for over a decade. And then, years later, he returned to public life in a way that would define how many people came to know him. He was appointed special counsel to investigate Russian interference in the 2016 election. And from that moment forward, Robert Mueller stopped being, for so many people, a public servant with a long career. He became something else. He became a symbol. For some, he was a necessary check on power. For others, he was the face of an investigation they believed was unfair, politically motivated, or excessive. And, of course, that's where opinions about him began to diverge sharply. And that's okay. That's part of living in a democracy. We are allowed to interpret events differently. We are allowed to disagree about things like investigations and decisions that are made and conclusions and so on and so on. You can believe the investigation was justified. you can believe it went too far, and you can also believe it didn't go far enough, or that it shouldn't have ever been done in the first place. Those are all political disagreements. Those are arguments that belong in a healthy public discourse. But what happened after his death, that wasn't about simple political disagreement. After word broke of Mueller's passing, Donald Trump, sitting president of the United States of America, posted a statement saying he was glad Mueller was dead. Now, just take a moment with that. The current president of the United States, arguably the most powerful human on the planet, responding to the death of a man who spent the majority of his life in service to this country, says that he's happy that the man is gone. This isn't really about interpretation. This isn't about spin. Really, how one side sees it versus how the other side sees it is largely irrelevant. This is about what was said and what it represents. Because when you look at that statement, it becomes very clear that this wasn't about policy. It wasn't about ideology. It wasn't about disagreement over, the direction of the country. This was personal. Donald Trump's relationship to Robert Mueller was shaped by one central fact. Mueller investigated him. Or, as Trump himself would probably put it, he didn't like Trump very much. For Trump, that investigation became more than just a legal process. It became a defining grievance of his first term, perhaps of his life, as far as that goes. He talked about it repeatedly. He framed the whole thing as an attack, as unfair treatment, as a witch hunt, as a hoax, as evidence of a system stacked against him. And over time, Mueller ceased being a person in that narrative. For Trump, certainly, as well as for his MAGA faithful. Robert Mueller was downgraded in their eyes. He was no longer a human. He was now a symbol. A symbol of that grievance. A symbol of being wronged. A symbol of being insulted. A symbol of something that needed to be opposed, rejected, and ultimately attacked. So when the president made that statement after Mueller's death, it really wasn't a reflection on a public figure. It read like something else entirely. It read like unresolved resentment, petulant anger, a childish jape. And that distinction is important because there used to be expectations that came with being president of the United States. Not the legal requirements, not rules written into law, just standards. There used to be an understanding, an unwritten one, that the presidency carries with it a certain level of dignity, a certain level of restraint, a recognition that your words do not exist in isolation, that the position is supposed to be larger than any one person. The president speaks for the office and for the country and for its people. A president's words are supposed to carry weight. At the very least, they shape tone. They influence how people think about what is acceptable. Both those that voted for that president and those that didn't. Presidents have historically recognized that, even in moments of disagreement. There are countless examples of past presidents living up to that responsibility. Presidents have issued statements acknowledging the passing of political opponents. They have attended funerals of people they disagreed with. They have spoken in ways that reflect an understanding that the office represents more than selfish desires and personal feelings, that it represents the country. And when a sitting president publicly, gleefully celebrates someone's death, that standard it's not just weakened, it's destroyed out in public for the entire world to see. Because the presidency is not just a power position. It is a position of example. It used to signal what is acceptable. It used to demonstrate how leaders should behave. It used to show by example how a disagreement is handled. Of course, many will say that this aspect of the presidency didn't suddenly fall apart on March 20th, the day that Mueller died. It's been battered and lampooned by the very holder of that office now for years. But this particular example of immaturity and vengeful spite is a new low, even for a president who lives constantly underfoot. We've seen this time and time and time again since 2017. When a president speaks with cruelty, it normalizes cruelty. When a president frames individuals as enemies rather than just opponents, it shifts how people engage with each other. It moves us away from debate and towards something more personal, more hostile, dehumanizing. That shift has taken hold, and I'll be damned if I know how it can be reversed. Because that line used to exist, that the line between disagreement and dehumanization, the line between ego and duty, the line between respect and farce, that line is gone for all intents and purposes, and people justify things they would never have justified before. They see opponents not as people with different views, but as threats, as evil. Empathy is in short supply. Hell, we've been told straight out that empathy is weakness. Respect is given or withheld based not on character of record or substance of any kind, but on nothing more than which side of an imaginary line someone happens to be standing on. Even basic decency is optional at this point. That's the significance of this moment. It's not just what was said, it's about the system, the reality that it reflects. It reflects a political culture where institutional responsibility means virtually nothing when held up against a personal grievance, where the office of the presidency is used as a platform for personal vendetta with little or no regard to the broader implications, without even regard for basic human decency, as far as that goes, where the distinction between public duty and bruised ego is non-existent. The office itself has been changed by thin-skinned, infantile whining. The presidency is supposed to be bigger than the individual who holds it. It's supposed to carry with it a sense of continuity, a sense of stability, a sense that regardless of who occupies it, certain standards will remain in place. Those standards have been abandoned, and it affects every facet of what once was a proud country. expectations going forward will be subject to this era. Future leaders will measure reactions based on this long-running bad example. It has told citizens of the United States that standards aren't standards, they're optional. And that brings us back to Robert Mueller. Because whatever people think about his role in the investigation, whatever opinions they hold about his decisions, the life he lived shouldn't be in question. A Marine who volunteered to serve in Vietnam. A man who was wounded in combat and recognized for his service. A career spent in law enforcement and public service. A Republican who served under presidents of both parties. That's his record. And the contrast between that life and the response from the sitting president is as stark as a difference can be. Not because one man was perfect, but because one man's life reflects a commitment to something larger than himself. And the response we saw from President Trump reflects something much, much smaller. Something petty. This is much more than simply elevating one individual and condemning another. It's about recognizing what we have become and what we face moving forward. Our future leaders, our future expectations, our own future priorities and behavior. Because ultimately, the issue isn't just what the president said. It's not simply about all the unpresidential things he's done and will no doubt continue to do. The issue is, what are we as a nation, as individuals? Do we continue to accept just moment after moment after moment in an ongoing stream of grotesque buffoonery? Do we throw up our hands and see it as typical, as expected, as something that just no longer surprises us, as something we just simply have to deal with, grin and bear it? Or do we stop and recognize that something important has been lost? That the standards we once assumed were stable were not as stable as we thought. That the lines we assumed would not be crossed are in fact well behind us now. And worse, that it has been normalized. You don't have to agree with Robert Mueller to recognize his humanity. You don't have to support his investigation to acknowledge his lifetime of service. And you don't have to like someone to understand that their death is not something to celebrate. Particularly if you're the leader of the United States. Those used to be basic ideas. I hope they still are, at least for more people than it seems they are. I think those old standards are still worth holding on to. They are still worth expecting from the people who lead us. In the end, Robert Mueller's life is a matter of record. And so is Donald Trump's response to his death. And the contrast between those two things is not subtle. It is as wide can be. One reflects service. The other reflects something else. So my question is this: what the hell do we do now? All right, thank you everybody for taking the time to listen to this episode of Your Neighbor on the Left. I always say that I would love to hear from you, but this week it's particularly a desire of mine to hear some feedback, because I'd like to know what my listeners think of this proposed change in format. As always, go to the website, www.neighborontheleft.com. And among other things, you can find a contacts page that has all of the social media links as well as the email address for the podcast. Any of these you can use to reach out and let me know what you think about this new format. What do you think about what I said? What do you have to say about it? Critiques, compliments, suggestions, whatever. I would love to hear them all. All right, so I'll be back on Wednesday with another episode of Your Neighbor on the Left. So between now and then, stay engaged, stay kind, and have the kind of week you'd wish for others.